Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. Join us as we continue the conversation with Adrianne Dumpson-Diggs and Dennis Maurice Dumpson. Let's tune in. Yeah, and I was going to tie it in as you both were speaking. One of the things that came up for me as you were talking about radical sensitivity in the workplace is, as you mentioned, Dennis, people of color are the most overlooked, right? There's often a pay disparity. There's also the experience disparity when it comes to glass ceilings and those things, which the lack of radical sensitivity would affect the way leadership is thinking about promoting different individuals, which directly affects access to wealth and advancement when it comes to additional economic opportunities. We kind of talked about the race thing. But then I think about the health, right? I think about the health part, Ms. Adrianne, because one of the things that you said, being someone who's experienced a toxic work environment, we don't talk about the taxation on our physical, our mental health, that then taxes our physical health, right? When we are in these environments that are not created for us and are not safe spaces for us. And it really does eat and affect our mental and then sometimes manifest into physical health, right? Because of the stress and all of the other things that we are experiencing. But to sort of transition to one of the terms that I thought about as you guys were talking about radical sensitivity in the workplace is, I think about the cultural taxation, especially when it comes to leaders and leaders of color and what that looks like. So I was curious for you guys to tell me your thoughts around how that shows up in either types of stats when you think about radical sensitivity in the workplace, or how does that idea of cultural taxation kind of tie into the importance of radical sensitivity in the workplace?
If I could, I want to go back to mental health just a bit, because one of the watershed moments for myself, I was on a board and was anticipating being the next board president for an organization that had significant issues, financial issues. I had a CEO who was leading the organization at that time, and we were working really closely together, trying to figure out how to get things done. It's in Philadelphia, so we were pulling connections, trying to see if we can get things to happen, moving things forward. And one day he said to me, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Like, I'm waking up with chest pains. And he giggled a little bit. And I said, nah, good brother, we not claiming that. When we get into the next board meeting, I'm going to tell him we need a day off. That was my response to it. I mentioned that to say probably a few months later, he had a death by suicide. And this is a Black leader. My response was one to say, like, let me see if I can get you a day off, because that was enough, right? So when we talk about like how culture manifests inside of these environments, for Black folks, sometimes the work is not just the work. It is also like how we are invested inside of it. If I mess this up, it's different than if white guy, white woman mess this up. If I mess this up, I might not be able to have this opportunity again, which creates this very unhealthy level of gratitude that we have the systems that don't honor us.
And unhealthy levels of stress.
Oh, right? Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And the stress is actually, it's, again, this idea of unending durability. Black folks are like, I would imagine, some of the leading people who are turnaround CEOs. I would even ask the audience to kind of like think about it. How many times have you seen an organization that was failing a little bit and a person of color or a Black woman comes in to be able to turn it around or fix it up or do this and that? We are utilized far more often than we are valued. So I think culturally it creates, and then we are asked to be grateful for the opportunities to be in these spaces. And then we take on the pressure of not only having to produce at a high level, which we do, we also have to take on the pressure of showing our gratitude through those actions. And that gratitude actually is toxic. It isn't healthy. You know what I mean? And I think that also creates a very tired, exhausted place for people of color, Black folks, to be able to lay our heads on. We have no rest, and that becomes a cultural issue.
And I want to double click on that durability or the resilience, the idea that we always have to be twice as good because we don't get the same opportunity. We're not going to get that same opportunity again, which sometimes creates a perpetuation, which I think you and Miss Adrianne kind of talked about in terms of how we play into systems that were never created by us or created, certainly not for us to thrive. But when you think about even your example with the CEO and thinking about going to the health piece, I was recently having a conversation as a leader myself and having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I saw this post very recently on Instagram. And we talk about burnout a lot, which happens to people of color in workspaces, especially in leadership roles. And Ms. Adrianne, sounds like that was definitely some of what you were experiencing in your role as well. But one of the things that was so interesting about this particular post is it said that burnout is also a reflection of us not getting our emotional needs met. And when I think about radical sensitivity, it's interesting because I feel like when we think about the workplace, we almost think about emotions and emotional needs needing to be separate from who we show up in as work. Like we almost treat it as we should treat like church and state when it comes to the way that we think about those things. But at the end of the day, we are humans who have emotions. And so we feel exhaustion, we feel all of these different things, and not getting the support that we need. Even Ms. Adrianne, I think you mentioned, right? Like not having that space for whether it's even creating intercommunities of the peers and people who are really understanding the challenges that we're going through, and just even having a place, not just to vent, but also to strategize, right? How do we change this? How do we change that system? So I wanted to get your reactions and thoughts to that, and then just kind of how you are thinking about the implementation of radical sensitivity. Is it just, sort of coaching, or are you thinking about it by way of like creating community for individuals who are having experiences?
Yeah, I'll start just as this is really where like I think the bifurcation of like how I approach it and how my mom approaches it really makes a great like connecting point too, because my mom, as she mentioned before, she said, I don't want anybody else to have to be able to do this. And what my company focuses on, we vitiate anti-Blackness inside the policy, practices, and procedures of particular organizations. Because of that, my mom's approach is trauma-informed based on the individual, which is necessary to being able to build community around those things. And what I want to build communities of practice around, or whatever, a coalition around, is organizations that are willing to act like they know beyond risk mitigation and compliance. Because I think one of the things that happens in a more corporatized environment is that we use compliance and risk as the reason for making all of our decisions, and we totally alleviate ourselves from having to think about humanity as being a core component of us growing growing things. So the future of this work, I hope that it's building community, but not just individualized. Like I actually think it needs to be like sectors really coming together, building communities of practice around how we agree, sage agreements about what a humane environment looks like, what it is, something that is just, it has to happen, and start to create an environment where if you're not doing this, you feel like you're working in a inhumane environment or whatever, because everybody else is moving in this next generation. So there'll be tools, there'll be practices that will do. I have ideas for platforms and all types of other stuff. My mom, when we started writing this book, I pulled out this Word document that was at least 7 million pages with all these like tools.
First of all, don't do this, Adrianne, like that.
It was a lot of work, but it's because that's how she thrives academically. Is like, how do I put this into a practice? She's a learning and development leader, so I think we'll have all those things. But only thing I was responding to that you mentioned too is I want people to recognize that, similar to how we said, it's not just about kindness. It's not just about the individual experience. Systems and sectors have to change, and there has to be community around that as well. It has to be general understanding, because if we're only focused on being compliant, because even when we talk about DEI and things of that nature, these aren't new concepts and they aren't novel. But what happens is that people then confuse compliance with humane practices, and they're not synonymous. So I think we want to build community around people who actually are interested in being humane in the workplace, not just compliant to what we have agreed to around like equitable or diverse workplaces will look like.
Right. Absolutely, because when you think about compliance, it's still very generic. There's a need to have more of a cultural responsiveness when you're thinking about what type of culture you're creating, what type of system by way of a workplace that you're creating that will be one that is safe and culturally responsive for all the different individuals, not just people who look like all of us on this screen, but all the different people who will work at that particular workplace.
Can I just add a tether to that too? Particularly because of the governmental world that we're living in, the governance of this country is despotic. The people that are going to be harmed the most are the people that are working in helping professions, are the people that are in nonprofits,
Yeah.
are people that are inside of schools. And if we only focus on people who are recipients of service and not the people who are delivering those services, the professionals that are working as caseworkers and teachers and managers and all this other stuff, we're going to have a lot of people who are unwell providing services to people that lack excellence and lack the quality that those communities deserve. So if we don't get this together and start coming up with like a community understanding around this, like from a sector perspective, it's all going to be a long road down. And we've seen this already happen through COVID and the huge amounts of mental health declines and, levels of exhaustion rising for people too. So I just wanted to mention that this moment also calls for us to be able to think about radical sensitivity with some more urgency attached to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it feels like a call to action, just to avoid those pitfalls that is so easy to kind of dive into. When you were speaking, Dennis, I was thinking about my journey, but in part of that journey was forgiveness, not only for myself, but also for that person. There are so many nuances to it. What happened to you? And that's just I know a lot of people may say that they're empaths and they feel, but when someone does something and you hear that old adage, hurt people hurt people. Well, they do. They do.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have some empathy for that as well. And that was a part of this healing for me, was to also practice that forgiveness, not only for myself for not protecting oneself, but as for the person who is like me in color, and living in a space that maybe they were unfamiliar with as well. So that grace and in the sensitivity of this whole framework really has to come full circle. So it is a touch point that I just wanted to add to that.
No, absolutely. I think what you brought up, obviously, I have a lot of personal kind of through lines with your similar story. And let me just preface, because I have a couple of team members who actually do listen to my podcast. I am not speaking of current management, but just in case they're listening, but I agree. I feel like as Black people, especially, and Black women especially, we are more often empathetic to people, and sometimes too empathetic. And I think what I've had to learn is I'm an empath. I definitely try and figure out, well, what happened? Right? Like, what happened to you? Who hurt you?
Right.
And then I can realize that and recognize that to understand likely where a person is coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And because two things can be true, and I can still hold them accountable and say it's unacceptable.
Yeah, exactly.
And they need to do better. Right? Like, I don't have to hate you. I don't have to have resentment for that. And you should be a better human being. You should work on
human-centered.
Right? Because I think sometimes we are a little too forgiving. You can recognize and be empathetic with experiences that a person has had and still hold them accountable and set your own personal boundaries and say that it's, unacceptable for them to treat, interact, communicate, whatever it is that they're doing.
If I could say, Joycelyn, too, like that accountability is actually the centerpiece of love, because what it says is that I have to, because again, with my point about not seeing people fully, when I see you fully, I can't create a story about who I want you to be. I think you have to be, I can question why you act in this way, but to your point, I still have to be able to acknowledge what it is you are doing in this moment, and I have to hold you accountable to that, because those are the ways that love actually is imbued. To be accountable for the ways that we treat people, the ways that we engage with people, for the systems that we, engender and foster that are inhumane or not equitable or don't create spaces for belonging. And also, I can acknowledge that doesn't come from it doesn't come from just the stratosphere, you know what I mean, magically
Right.
kind of appearing on top of people. They are layered. We are in depth and we are complex and we have full lived experiences that inform all the things that we do. But that accountability is the love. So I just also encourage like the audience of people listening too, holding people accountable actually is the space that love resides in. And that accountability doesn't mean punitive always. It doesn't mean this forcefulness that I think we all are all considering. And it doesn't mean that that's alleviated. It just means that accountability is fit for what is happening. It means that people know that they have to be responsible for the ways that they move and act, and that you are not here acting like you are unseen. You are visible. I see you. You are not invisible in this space. I recognize who you are. I recognize why you're even doing it. And I'm still going to be here to have a conversation with you and hold you accountable because I love you despite all of those flaws. So I think even in this space of thinking about radical sensitivity, the reason why I think my mom and I are kind of like, we don't want to make this about kindness as a sole feature, because then it turns into this thing about everybody has to just get along and kumbaya and all this other stuff. And
Well,
that's not the gig. Please.
I was gonna say, but even as a leader, like I'm not necessarily a nice leader. I'm a kind leader. And I think to me, when I think about kindness versus niceness, kindness is where the love and the accountability and all those things, right? Because I actually care about who you are as an individual and I care about your growth and your development. So the only way to do that is to both support you and provide all of that positive feedback, but also the constructive feedback as well.
Yeah.
And being nice, in my opinion, telling you what you want to hear, telling you what's going to make you feel good, kumbaya, everybody get along. There's never any conflict. Conflict isn't always bad, right? Most of the beautiful things come through some version of conflict, whether it's internal, external, like this is how you get over and overcome. And so I did want to just add that there when you think about
And
kindness.
I completely agree. I agree too on the end of like nice and kindness, because I do think that being nice is sometimes the facade and it's the inauthenticity of I said the right thing, it's thoughts and prayers versus like direct, deliberate action. You know what I mean? Like in that way too. I completely agree. I think what radical sensitivity, what we're saying is that the awareness actually comes before you're able to be nice. Before you're able to get to that, you have to be aware and truly acknowledge what you are seeing. And oftentimes what we get to is we get to a point to where we are ready to be kind to people when we're not fully deeply invested and curious about what happens. So like even the questions we asked earlier, like what happened to you? That is a precursor to me actually being able to express kindness. That questioning and that interrogation of like, where is this coming from? Why are you like this? That actually is what happens before we can actually be kind. So I think like what we're suggesting is be kind to yourself by allowing the sensitivities that you are feeling to drive you to be curious, so that way you can give that to other people. That curiosity will lead us to being able to be kinder in the work that we do. But we didn't want kindness to be the centerpiece of what this is, and people get that confused with this being like a practice of how we are aware about these environments. And again, stop acting like you don't see the things you see happening. Stop acting like you don't know that this person is being a mean tyrant because they're meeting all their KPIs and they're doing all this other stuff, and you're acting like they're not doing anything wrong that's like hurting people. Like you don't see the retention rates in your office. That's not being kind, because we refuse to be aware. We refuse to have awareness lead the way that we engage, and we refuse that awareness leading us to be curious about how do we get to having a more healthier environment. So completely agree. You know what I mean? There is a way that kindness is, in there, and I would prefer more kind people. I'm from Philadelphia. We are both from Philadelphia, and folks will say like, in Philly, there's no nice people in Philadelphia, but a lot of people are kind. You know what I mean? Like there's kind folks. People are not going to be smiling at you every time you walk down the street, but they're going to be coming. If you needed something was happening, there's a bunch of people that would be there to do that as well. So I think the awareness portion is what we're trying to lead with.
I love that. And that was actually going to be one of my questions in terms of what do you think we should, as individuals and community members be thinking about when it comes to understanding radical sensitivity. I think you hit the nail on the head, which is it's really about the awareness. And it sounds like it's also just about the self-awareness, which is just gonna say it's hard for a lot of people if they're not willing to do that work. That's number one. People don't always want to look within, but there's a certain self-awareness that has to be there in order for you to then be radically sensitive to others, because you have to think about the way that you're showing up in spaces, but specifically in the workplace as a leader. Is Adrianne, you were going to say something?
No, I was just agreeing as a self then others perspective. You can't help anyone. You're what they tell you in the airplane, put your mask on yourself first, and then you can, because you can't do anything else. And that's, part of being when I was in grad school, and, Dennis went to the same college I went to. So, he caught me up now. He was already there. But one of those um, curriculum perspectives was a self than others. Before we got into anything, it was like you have to know oneself before you can stem out and help anyone in this world. You have to learn about yourself. You have to be able to recognize those small nuances that happen to individuals on your teams, around you in your leadership circles. And if you can't pick those things up, that's probably because you're focused on the wrong things. Being able to have that recognition of what it looks like and feeling safe enough to speak up about it is probably one of the biggest, not just the anonymous Dropbox, because people don't even believe those are anonymous. It's like you can't have a box and there's a camera pointing at it. You know what I mean? You just can't have those type of things. But when there's not safety at the helm, people will always come away with, well, that's my thought, but I'm not going to share it. You know what I mean? So, with the sensitivity in the workplace is just such a, any form of day-to-day practices. It's kindness, but it's not. You know what I mean? It is thoughtful leadership, but it's not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's everything. It's everything.
The thing about hear it is that it starts with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like people can only meet you as deeply as they've met themselves. And so those people have to practice radical sensitivity with themselves first to be able to then give it to others. And oftentimes, it's the internal conflict they often have with themselves, and the way that they internally speak to themselves is actually how they show up in the way that they speak to and interact with other people as well. And so once they're able to have that self-awareness and do that self-healing work, which I think should be important for any leader, and they're able to your point, show up better in that space.
Yeah.
So my question is going to be like, what's next for you? And you've mentioned a book a couple of times, but let's talk about it. Tell the listeners what's happening with this book.
Yeah. So
can I just jump in before you start? Because he said I had a whole Word document full of that was like 1,000 pages. Well, let me just explain that it started out to be a workbook. And he said, girl, you have this is a book. This is not a workbook. So my idea initially started off as a workbook, but it evolved into this.
Into an actual book. Okay, I like that. So then I'll punt to you, Dennis, to tell me what's coming up, and then maybe Miss Adrianne, you can close us out with like what that's looking like in terms of the book, and if there are any other things that you guys are looking to build out as well.
Yeah, I mean, so the book Radical Sensitivity Awareness Practices for Humane Communities is what we're working on together, where we're leveraging my mom, being funny about like the 1,000 or 100 pages of like documents or whatever. But really what it is, it's about a career that's steeped in learning and development and trauma-informed care, and like this idea of how do we become human-centered and rooted, as she has mentioned, inside of the workplace. Leverage with my lens as a scholar of race, someone who studies it often and practices it through my business and my work, as well as inclusion and equity. And we're bringing those things together to be able to have, to open up a new conversation, and particularly because we wanted to make sure that the audience was clear. We wanted to talk to people that were in social services, that were in the, helping professions, that are a part of what, is defined as the care economy. And we want like people to be able to be supported in that. So people can learn more at radicalsensitivity.org. And if you want to know anything more specific, you can email us at info@radicalsensitivity.org. But that's the kind of all these things that we've talked about is what the book is, inviting us into. It's inviting us to consider a new way of being able to work, a new way to be able to like live while we are working. You know what I mean? And just inviting us to be able to think of awareness as not just a nice to have, but like an essential part of actually having a humane environment. And actually, it is one of the earliest things that drives our curiosity about the types of places that people deserve and require to work in. Because I think a part of this too is that we are suggesting that radical sensitivity isn't an addition to or a nice to have. It actually is an essential part of being able to have an environment, one that is recognizing, dealing with, and grappling with the things that are happening at any given moment and being able to be proactive in building out change. And our goal is to be able to start that conversation and build something out from it. So that book will be out between February and March of 2025. And you'll be able to see pre-work of it and a small workbook developed by my mother on our website. Just as this podcast is being aired, you'll be able to see that. I'll turn it over to Mom for additional insight.
Yeah. And then
I think you hit on so much. But I'm sorry, Joyce.
No, I was actually just calling on you, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really happy and looking forward to the work that's going into this book and the workbook as well, just to really tap in to leadership. Leading people is just more than just a supervision task or duty. I would always say, as we see one another more than we see our own family in the line of time. So to not lead with sensitivity is something that happens far too often, not just in the nonprofit sector, but you would think where you're helping people that this would be less of an issue, but it's everywhere. It's in hospitals, it's in corporate industries, so it really doesn't matter. We see it every day on YouTubes or whatever you're following. There's so many aspects of insensitivity that are just ravishing the day to day. I'm happy about this piece of work that it would begin to bridge some of those gaps so people can see where they show up as leaders, as individuals. I think this is just a first step. I'm looking forward to taking this journey. I appreciate my son, who is one of three. I don't know, but I'm so happy to take this journey along with him and for his grace and kindness, as a leader. It's just a beautiful thing to be able to experience with him.
I love that. And so you already give our listeners, because typically I ask one book, any quotes that you guys sort of live by as we start kind of wrapping?
I actually wrote one down, which I always say, you can't pour from an empty cup, so you have to pour into yourself before you can share back to that self and others.
Dennis?
Yeah, I grapple with this. I was telling my mom earlier, what I'm sitting with right now is my grandmother, who's my mother's mother, said she had in simple and enduring wisdom, and something she always said was, be sweet. At the time when she would say it, like, I'd be hyped up about something would get me angry, and then I'm a child, and then she'd be like, how about just be sweet? And I'd be like, that is not answering my anger at this moment. It's not answering the thing that I need to get out of me. But what she was addressing is to be able to see something in yourself, you know what I mean, that allows you to be able to see goodness inside of you. Because oftentimes when we're feeling overstimulated, when we're feeling angry, when we're feeling, intense in those ways, it's because we don't feel heard, we don't feel here. And that actually is the sensitivity. And the sweetness wasn't to the world. The sweetness was to me. You know what I mean? And when I think about that, I think like that's what has been impressed on me, is just like this, like, consistent, enduring wisdom that is simple and also very complete. So that's something else. And then just as a book, I would also mention Dr. Sean Ginwright's 4 Pivots, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves is a great book. It focuses on his concept that he coined, which is healing-centered engagement and radical healing, which is also like a wonderful introduction into us thinking about healing-centered environments too, which is another book that I would do.
I love that. And any action items, and sort of the last thing we'll give to, if you have any, is ways in which our listeners can stay connected with you. I know we gave the website so that they can stay connected with the work, but if they want to stay connected with you.
I have a YouTube channel, but I'm not supposed to say that.
You are supposed to
Um,
say that. Say that.
Yeah, you are. We want to support you. So yes, tell us about your YouTube channel. What's your handle? Or
it's what Adrianne thinks, and it also is where I share my mother's recipes. She was a phenomenal cook. Dennis also has made many appearances on that with his bougie recipes. He's so genuine and he's an awesome cook as well. So, yeah, but you can find me on what Adrianne thinks. But did you have the email addresses, Dennis, or anything?
I think you
The
said
email
info,
address
right?
is info@radicalsensitivity.org, but
Okay.
also it's whatadrianthinks.com, whatadrianthinks.com too. Yeah.
Hmm. But
And for
thank you
ooh,
so much. Mhm.
and for me, you can go to my personal website, which is dennismaurice.com, to learn more about me if you choose. My racial equity company is Invest, BLK, like investblack.org. And you can learn more about my company as well as like our Black and Empty Fund, which is up to date, has given up a little bit over $25,000 to Black folks and in the interest of Black people. And we're currently starting to do a quitting fund that we're developing as well too. And you can find me on social media. I'm everywhere but X or Twitter. I'm not on there anymore, but everywhere else at the name Dennis Maurice. So feel free to connect and move forward with us.
Yes, yes. This has been so awesome. I love the conversation. I felt like we could have kept chatting because there's so many things that this bubbles up. And maybe I'll just have to have you guys back on. But I want to thank you for kicking off the new year with me in this episode. Really excited for what's to come. I think it's going to be really important given the environment, the national climate that we're in, that we really are thinking about radical sensitivity as we are engaging with one another in general. I'm really excited to introduce this to our listeners and have you guys be my first multi-guest podcast. This is great. Mother-son duo, aka twins. I just want y'all to know,
Thank you so
you couldn't
much.
deny Dennis, and then vice versa if you wanted to. Well, thank
And
you so
thank
much,
you.
Miss Adrianne. Thank you, Dennis,
Thank you
for
so much.
Thank
yes, and enlightening our listeners. I look forward to following your journey as you guys introduce radical sensitivity to the world. So again, congratulations and thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much.
Absolutely. All right.
thank you.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.